So moving on to a well, actually, a few different stories that we've connected together with a theme, and I think I put in our agenda notes here. The theme was colonial issues, but it all
So
really,
it's a narrow theme that's simply expressed. Yeah.
indeed.
No complexities there.
No complexities, indeed. Yeah, human evolution, that was easy compared to this one. Um, but tourists rush to climb Uluru on last day before permanent closure is the headline that kicks this section off. It's a news story that I'm linking to from, in this instance, The Guardian. But obviously there's been global coverage of this.
Absolutely, quite extensive.
And of course, Uluru, I remember when I was growing up, was more famously known as Ayers Rock. It's a very distinctive geological formation, the almost Martian red rock of Australia, or that part of Australia, jutting up into the sky, a very flat table-like surface on the top. It is iconic. It is rightly iconic, and of course, people, understandably, are and have always been compelled to go to that place. And in recent years, it's been clear that the access that people have to the place is not only problematic from a cultural perspective, because Uluru is a sacred site to Aboriginal populations, but also it's been causing literal damage to the site. Traffic, in terms of foot traffic erosion, there's been no clear pathways up and down the mountain, so people clambering all over it. They've been leaving rubbish behind, and I think possibly a previous segment that we covered highlighted how the simultaneous intrigue in the site, but also the lack of formal facilities, led to all sorts of really gruesome and essentially human byproducts being left all over the place, as it were, on the site, and it just wasn't working. In particular, in the context of this as a sacred national, internationally significant place, and it's interesting how on the one hand, I get it. I'm all for it. I understand and I recognize, and if I ever get to go anywhere near it, I will respect the fact that access is no longer granted. But it's curious, isn't it, how the response of an awful lot of people has been to rush there and to have this last huge push of massive amounts of access and to essentially subvert the desire of the national park to 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 mitigate that issue by having one last big push of the problems ballooning. It's a curious thing about human nature, and what do you make of it? I mean, would you, if you were in Australia, would you have rushed to go up the mountain while you still could?
Well, I'd sort of question slightly that particular view, because if you look at the subtext of the uh, cover, some of the coverage, and again,
Hmm.
quoting from the Guardian, other news outlets are available, but they quote one of the park rangers who was responsible for the area around Uluru,
Hmm.
in the Uluru Kata Tuta National Park, somebody called Changu Thomas, um, who said, "This is really important for me and for Anangu and for the region. It's a strong example of Anangu making decisions for their land." But then he went on to say, "At the end of the day, respect is a choice. Obviously, it's disappointing to see people wanting to climb, but compared to the school holidays, this crowd isn't too much." In other words, that they've had bigger crowds on other days. So it may be that there's a sort of, what you're seeing there is the people wanting to take the last selfie, the people wanting to be the last person up, or onto the rock or whatever, who wasn't from the local community, indigenous community. But the it may indicate perhaps a broader acceptance of what the national park have done by closing off access.
So are you sort of suggesting that by mandating almost a bylaw
Mm,
that is respectful, you take away the
yeah.
ability for people to respect the site, and therefore you're not actually guaranteeing that people
I
understand the reason for that respect?
I have to say I've been really torn about this,
Okay.
trying to think through the ramifications of it, because part of me, you know, I at my core philosophy really, I'm with the Scandinavian idea, the Swedish idea of the Allemansrätt,
Hmm.
you know, the every man's right to roam, the you know, but then I got to think about it, that even that is controlled in Sweden, where and parts of Norway and so on. It's that there are restrictions
Of
on that,
course.
legal restrictions and moral
But
restrictions.
also, with respect, you can hardly get further away from Scandinavia than Australia. It's one of those things where actually,
No,
it,
I'm talking about universal human experience here. You know,
no, but no, no,
right,
but in that sense, I mean, genuinely, and I don't mean just geographically. I know that's a pithy thing to say, but also culturally, the right to roam from group to group within Aboriginal cultures was not guaranteed, even thousands of years ago. Access was via permission. If you went through someone else's territory, you had to have essentially a ticket that said, "I'm allowed to be here." So even in a time before modern access and tourism and selfies was an issue, it wasn't
yeah.
just that people had this sort of this free roaming communing with the landscape. It was a carefully monitored thing, not just accessing the things like Uluru, but also just going about your business. It wasn't
No,
free roaming.
absolutely. You know, exactly. You know,
Hmm.
there are, you know, tribes have political and religious territories or
Hmm.
clans or however society organized itself. No, yeah, and you jumped in on me there, and I said when I said
Sorry.
my base ideal would be was that everybody, you know, in the modern world, you know, we ought to recognise an equal right to. But then I got to thinking about it, and as I say, as well as you know, in the Northern European tradition, where that right to roam is enshrined in law,
Hmm. Hmm.
there are also legal and moral restrictions
Hmm. Hmm.
on it, which are recognised as being for the general good. And and then I got to thinking in religious terms, uh, unless you're you know, with the exception of sort of rampant Islamophobes and so
Hmm.
on, uh, pretty much everybody respects the idea that if you're a non-Muslim, you don't visit Mecca and the Kaaba.
Hmm. Hmm.
Kaaba.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that you know that, and you don't even try.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, that's respected as a religious tradition, that it's appropriate to observe.
Hmm.
And you know, so and then it goes, and then I got to thinking, okay, in secular terms, um, we that there are issues, for example, on access to parts of Hadrian's Wall,
Hmm.
where there's now talk of is it even practical to try and restrict visitors, or do you have to educate visitors not to walk on the wall, for example?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then I got to thinking,
Yeah.
then I was looking at some of the coverage, and I've got in front of me a piece of a video showing the queue to climb Uluru on that last day,
Hmm.
and it reminded me of nothing so much as almost identical pictures and video that appeared, I think, earlier on this year, of the slope up to the summit of Mount Everest,
Mm.
and with the discussion about whether the it is appropriate, safe and appropriate in ecological terms and environmental terms, to allow that many people to try to, you know, form a, you know, almost a production line of summit selfies,
Yeah.
with all the issues that raises in terms of
Well,
not just the danger
with
of
that
people who aren't necessarily.
with that line, I believe a couple of people fell to their death.
Indeed.
Like,
And also
queuing for a
again, there
selfie.
are, you know, absolutely, and there
Mm.
are horrendous stories about the amount of rubbish and human waste that's being left on the slopes, on the approaches to Everest now.
Mm.
You know,
Mm.
it's a major environmental issue.
Mm.
Exactly the same issues that were being cited in a cultural context here at Uluru. So, you know, it's actually not that unique an example, is what I'm saying. That and it appears to be, to me now, having thought it through, an appropriate response to both religious, cultural, and actually environmental pressures.
Okay, okay. I'm sorry I jumped on you there. Sorry.
No, no, no.
No, no. But I suppose in that sense, so the reason I did is because I find it interesting. I've always found actually the way that different groups in Australia managed their politics and their access. I've always found that interesting. But also, I find it interesting, as you say, from a standpoint of, for example, access to things like Hadrian's Wall. Whenever we go over to my favourite stone circle, Castle Rig in Cumbria, there's always people standing on top of the stones, and that there'll be 6 foot tall stones, and someone standing on it, putting their arms out like they're being somehow original, all so that they can have their own little personal thing on their social media page. I know it's always happened. I know that Georgians went there and picnicked, and and before social media was a thing, you'd get people with their with their disposable cameras standing on things and taking photos. I recognise that, but I think there is, and it sounds as though this is more or less where you've come to in that logic. I think there's something to be said for for the power of recognizing that actually sometimes you're not allowed to do something, or you're not allowed to go somewhere. It engenders, and it should remind us that there are ways in which we should, uh, respect is is a word you could use, but also another word is just to say it it gives form and structure to our lives to have places where you can't go. And this is something that people often find very reassuring in a very formal religious way. This idea, say, of the Holy of Holies in a temple, or or places. I mean, often, for example, again, in the case of things like stone circles, it's thought that in prehistory, perhaps access to the middle of that place would be reserved for certain types of people. It gives us form and structure, and it reminds us that we are part of a society. And I think something like Mecca actually is um, an excellent analogy, which it's funny because initially I had this sort of this glib notion there. Yeah, well, one of the reasons why people don't go there is because there used to be historically threatened. It was threatened that you'd be violently dealt with if you if you turned up there and you weren't allowed to. And but at the same time, that was also the case for Aboriginal culture. Sometimes um, trespassing on land would be an offence that was capital. I suppose. I mean, this is a slightly rambling way of going about it, but these other issues that we're highlighting in this segment include, for example, just for food for thought. You highlighted a story from the Reuters uh, press agency. Pope asks forgiveness for theft of controversial Amazon statues, and you also linked to a French language. Um, a French language story as well, which is very similar. And of course, I can immediately see a common thread here, people not fully understanding or respecting the beliefs of others in particular. But what brought this headline to your attention?
Um, like a lot of these things, it popped up on my Twitter feed,
Right. Mm.
and coming around the same time as the Uluru story, and with against the ongoing background, of the ongoing discussions about things like the Benin bronzes and our attitudes to colonial artifacts, or
Mm.
artifacts from native cultures obtained during the colonial period.
Mm.
Um, it struck me as being really interesting, but it's actually a very contemporary story. At the beginning of October, beginning of this month, and this last month, um, the Vatican was having a conference of bishops in Rome about the environment and the church in the Amazon and the threat to the environment.
Mm.
That was the
Mm.
title of the conference.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of that conference, some religious artifacts from some of the native peoples were put on
Mm.
exhibition in a church nearby
Okay.
in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Some uh, what are described as Catholic militants um, stole the artifacts, which they considered as pagan idolatry,
Right.
from the church and dumped them in the River Tiber, videoing this and posting this along with a statement of why they'd done it.
Sorry,
So
sorry,
you
and
have
this happened during the conference. Like this was an
it
ancillary
happens during
event.
the conference.
Good.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't even read the story. I just sort of read the headline. Oh my goodness, Andy, what the heck? Okay, right, go on. Yeah.
um, and the Vatican, according to the Reuters news agency, the Vatican then accused ultra-conservative Catholic social media of fomenting hate and saying in an editorial that the statues were, in fact, quote, an effigy of maternity and the sacredness of life, acknowledging the importance of those artifacts to the people that made them.
Wow.
Uh, um, so it's there are so many layers to that in terms of the if you compare the attitudes to the church or some members of the church in the colonial period in terms of forced conversions and
Uh-huh.
so on.
Uh-huh.
But now we're in a situation where the church is seeing the Catholic Church, I'm talking about particularly here, but obviously other religious organisations will have similar issues and discussions. But the church is seeing itself as both a religious and an environmental body in the context of Amazonia,
Mm.
trying to have a positive relationship with native peoples, but some hardline Catholics see that as selling out the core beliefs.
But
So
but but also, and the reason why I'm so astounded here, sorry, is that I thought this was like a historic theft of statues, like in the past. I had no idea. Oh my goodness! So in that sense, this is current. This is happening right now, and it really reinforces the fact that
absolutely,
actually this isn't just historic, historic, as it were, guilt from a colonial perspective. These issues are very much live. Yeah.
are
Fa
still in some parts of the world and and in some cultures, in some religious traditions, these stories that we wrestle with as the ethics of as archaeologists and historians
yeah, yeah.
and so on are absolutely current in the real world as well.
Well, and you know, it reminds me of something, and it makes me think of the way in which actually this isn't just cultural or religious. This has another element to it. For example, here in the UK, especially in England and Wales, well, in particular in England, it's not uncommon to find carvings of the so-called Green Man in
Yeah,
churches. A sort of
very common.
you know, well, actually, his origins are very obscure, probably for very good reasons that they've been obscured. But it seems to be something that's vaguely pagan, vaguely tied maybe in with the work of stonemasons, some sort of belief and ritual and something that basically isn't Christian, but is nonetheless
It's like the
tied.
shilling a gig in Ireland. Well,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it is nonetheless tied to now Christian monuments, and in some ways
yeah,
that is seen as a benign, innocent version of alternative representations of a relationship with nature coming into a Christian setting and being kind of harmless and acceptable and
repressive tolerance. It's called.
well, it's repressive tolerance, but also actually also a curio. So, for example, there's a green man
That's true.
in the undercroft of Durham Cathedral, where you can go and have a cup of tea and a scone and see what is essentially a or quite possibly a non-Christian symbol in the church.
Yeah.
It's interesting how here the uh, arguably the reason for the utter disdain for these symbols is not necessarily that they are pagan or other, because obviously Rome is firkin filled with pagan symbols. Rome is a
Yeah.
center of pagan symbols, um, but it's because these pagan symbols are unfamiliar. And I'm not going to extend it into say therefore it is racist, because I don't think it's an easy thing just to draw that straight line, but this does highlight one of the roots, for example, of what becomes racism is this utter intolerance for that which is unfamiliar. If these had been representations of Jupiter Maximus, was it Maximus, and uh, you,
Sol Invictus and all the rest of it.
yeah, or
Yeah.
classical Greek imagery,
mm.
then they would have been tolerated. They wouldn't have been seen as so offensive. And so I think it speaks something of also actually of human nature here. Well, no, sorry, no. What we're often told is human nature, but actually is often actually a very quick reaction to the unknown. And obviously, of course, there are various examples of that across the world. But
I take issue with you there on the idea that Roman religious symbolism um, wouldn't have met with the same reaction. The argument on the part of the militants who took the artifacts appears to have been that the offence was this was pagan religious material being put on exhibition in a church as a valid uh, a valid item, and they saw that as putting paganism on a level with
no, no.
Catholic Christianity.
There are various examples where if an artist is well known enough in the Western world, then their work is accepted in a church setting. It's seen as, oh, how wonderful! We've got one of Leonardo's things here, or one of Michelangelo's things here. If it was showing a classical story, and also actually, it's also this. Actually, it's worthwhile saying this as well. In some respects, I've always, as a child, I always wondered why this was the case, and as I've grown up, I've sort of come to certain conclusions that classical and Roman and Greek, broadly speaking, mythologies are seen as a harmless form of paganism. The Greek pantheon is something that we reference quite well. We have referenced, especially, for example, in highfalutin English society and in the Western world, without really thinking about it, because it's seen as something which is essentially a continuation of the Christian world, basically sanitized because it was Roman. And it's interesting how we tend to be, and indeed I know of a couple of instances of for example, artistic expression where people will bring in symbols such as dinosaurs. They'll bring in things like Roman gods into a Christian setting, and they are not rejected. They're not seen as questionable because they are part of the sort of the cultural background, the background radiation of that religious life. And I understand that, yes, for example, in uh, oh, I forgot what it's called now, but in the very famous church in Rome that was a pagan temple that had the hole in the ceiling, that very
Okay,
famous. Yes, there was a point at which there was a very explicit rejection of the symbols in there, and they were taken out. But actually, also there is still the building is still essentially a pagan building. It still has writings and inscriptions and roots that come from that background radiation and that aren't rejected they're not thrown into the river Tiber. Put it that way. You know,
and you can think, you think of other examples like the Hagia Sophia in
yeah,
Istanbul that became which was built as a Greek Orthodox church, which then became a mosque.
yeah.
But they didn't when it became a mosque. The Christian iconography and mosaics and so on weren't destroyed.
No, and well, in that instance, I think the argument is the idea that these are common religions of the book. I think that's often
Hmm.
something which is used to, but also then again, there's also cross pollination in the other direction as well. For example, again, coming back to Durham Cathedral, lots of its architecture is essentially mosque architecture of the time that's been used in a Christian setting in the northeast of England. And so
Yeah.
this is the reason why I say that is that I think that actually people can accept the other if it is already part of their understanding of this is the world that we live in, and
Mm.
ultimately in this case extremist Catholics accept that somehow Catholicism um, became the premier belief above that and is part of that and is an extension of as I say, it's that background noise. It seems that and again a little bit like the Green Man in an English setting, but it seems that this response to the other uh, is one that that people are often quick to do. They're often quick to say that is alien, that is wrong, that is different. But they are also, and the only reason why I'm labouring this is just to say they're also utterly blind to the everyday others that permeate their society, and that are actually part of the foundations in this instance of the Catholic Church, and the expression of Christianity that comes out of Roman Catholicism. if so, I mean, it's a complex thing, and it is a delicate thing. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there's a direct line between Jupiter and St. Peter's Basilica. I'm not, but
Well, even allowing for the fact that the Catholic vestments are based on the court dress of the Roman imperial court, and that the idea of a basilica is a Roman civic building.
yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what I was going to say, actually. Was it is that the trappings of those former vestiges of authority came in
Mm.
and were not even really noticed because that was just how authority was expressed, and then it became simply Roman Catholicism. If 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 these people really thought about the fact that actually the vestiges of authority that they respect actually come from a pagan setting, I wonder how challenged by that they would be. I've always been fascinated by that, and in particular, I was fascinated as a child when I realised that, that for example at university, people who were vicars had in their youth studied classics, and I think, well, how do they match that up? How do they grow up studying these gods over here and then choose to have their particular profession, or choose to express their profound belief through their profession in a Christian setting? And the answer is it's all subtly part of just this background that people don't even see, they're not even aware of. And but in the case of the Amazonian statues, they are so different, they're so not part of that background radiation, that's why the response is immediate and violent, you know.
I think there's another, and it's the last point I think I want to make on this particular segment,
Hmm.
is that uh, um, I think I would argue that in terms of fundamentalism of any kind, um, it doesn't do historical perspective of the kind that you've just been describing.
No,
It
it also doesn't do
it
irony
takes the
either.
view, yeah.
It has no
It,
sense
it,
of irony.
it by its very nature, it just does not want things to change.
No.
It wants what it sees as the status quo to be maintained,
And it imagines that
or in
status
some cases,
quo has always been the case as well. It
precisely. It
pretends it's
assumes
always
that
been there.
what a fundamentalist believes is the the status quo, the true belief, whatever, is unchanging,
Mm,
and therefore anything that challenges that in the present
mm,
has to be rejected.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So all the subtleties and nuances that you just described are actually completely irrelevant to that kind of line of argument, which I think is what we're seeing here.
Mm. No, I
You know,
think
they don't see those artifacts in context. All they see is a pagan artifact in a church. It has to be got rid of.
burn the witch. Yeah. Um. Okay. Well,
No, exactly. No,
yeah,
that's exactly what. Yeah,
yeah,
it is that simple.
yeah.
I think.
Well, there was actually a third story in this segment, but I think we've had a very juicy conversation about the two that we're in here. I'll just very briefly say it's an article that's worth reading, so we'll just flag it for that. We'll put it in there as something that's worth reading in the links below. The headline being Britain was built on the backs of slaves, of black slaves as well, in particular. A memorial is the least that they deserve. It's an opinion piece written extolling the virtues of, in particular in the context of Black History Month, memorializing the less than voluntary sacrifice of so many human beings in our history. So again, related
Well,
issues
I
worth
think
reading.
actually,
Hmm.
yeah, I think actually, I will flag up what is very likely to be my media pick for our November watching brief when we recorded at the end of the month,
Hmm.
which is a documentary that's being broadcast on ITV Channel 4
Hmm.
on Sunday, 10th of November, to coincide with what in the UK and I think in America too is the remembrance period for the dead of World War One and World War Two.
Hmm.
Remembrance Sunday, as we call it in England,
Hmm.
in Britain. And it is a documentary that has been quite heavily trailed, which has the hypothesis that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, formerly the Imperial War Graves Commission, which was the organisation that was set up to look after the uh, resting places and memorials of service personnel who lost their lives during World War One and World War Two.
Mm-hmm.
That in some cases, black service personnel have been treated differently to their white counterparts, when the founding tenet is that everybody is treated equally regardless of their origin or rank.
Or their creed. Yeah. Mm.
Or their creed,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah. Mm. Okay. Okay. Well, again, related issues worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.